No one got cracked over the head for no reason. Dispatches from a crime reporter. What is it about crime that we find so fascinating, even if at the same time the details are repugnant? Why exactly do we immerse ourselves in true crime podcasts and TV shows? In his compelling book, Martin Brunt draws on the most shocking and harrowing stories he's covered over the past 30 years to document the life of a crime reporter and assess the public obsession with crime. Delighted to be joining me live on the line from somewhere in the UK, I should imagine, is Martin Brunt himself. Martin, good morning to you.
Good morning, Giles.
Good to have you with us. We have an obsession with crime. Has this always been a particularly British thing, do you think? Why are we so obsessed with true crime podcasts and the like?
I don't know if it's a peculiarly British thing. I think it applies all around the world, and there are lots of answers to that. But there's no doubt that we absorb true crime novels and podcasts and TV dramas. The biggest selling author of all time is supposedly Agatha Christie. That will give you an indication. And in the book, I do explore the various reasons for this. I think to begin with, there's a bit of a clue in, imagine you're on a motorway and there's a car crash. And don't we all slow down and gawp at what's happened? And we are intrigued, I think, by other people's misfortune. But at the same time, we're grateful that it's not us. But we do imagine, what if? How would I react? How would I deal with that? What are the circumstances in which that terrible thing has happened as we slowly, build up the traffic and gawp at what's going on the side of the motorway? I think that's a starting point. But I think the obsession really is more with violent crime. It is, for most of us, something that happens to other people. But we need to know about it. We need to understand it so we can avoid it and protect ourselves. And, my observations are one thing, but I do also talk to other people in the book. There's a criminologist who says that there's a subconscious survival technique going on. Society survives by knowing how to avoid the extremes of violence. A psychologist, a female psychologist I spoke to, said, yes, that's true, but women are much more likely to be the victims rather than the perpetrators of violence. So they need to absorb true crime. And they do. 95% of people who buy true crime books apparently are women. And of course, women are bombarded by people like me with stories about women as victims. So they have it from all directions. So, I think some of those are the reasons why there is this obsession with true crime.
And yet when a shocking crime does take place in a quiet village, in a nondescript suburban cul-de-sac or something, it's almost as if we compartmentalize, as the Americans would say, our lives from what we see in the screen. And so what you hear more often is, we never thought this would happen in our quiet little town, our sleepy little patch.
Yes, it's happened in my town. I live in a rather quaint market town in the south of England. We don't have a very high crime level, but there was an appalling murder of two drug dealers, got on the train, came down to my town because they'd been robbed by somebody who lived in my town. They found where he lived. They went into his flat. He was with other people, but they held these other people in arm locks, whatever, and stabbed this guy in front of them, and then walked out and just sauntered off back to the station and were about to catch the train back to London, thinking that they would get away with it. But of course they didn't, because the police were onto them. I still think that for most people, violent crime particularly is something that happens to others. And we are intrigued about how it occurs, how those people deal with it. And I think also there's a sense of justice. People like a sense of justice, so they'll follow the story of a crime to the end, to the trial, and so forth.
Is there how do you keep a certain sense of detachment when you are crime reporting? Because you've been doing this for a while, And just when you think, is it a case when just when you think that nothing can shock you, and then you have something like happened in your own sleepy market town, and you think, my goodness, there's a propensity to look back at it in the past as rose-tinted spectacles, and we've never been so violent. It's never been so much violent crime. But of course, that's just our rose-tinted spectacles.
Yeah, I mean, stories happen all the time. I mean, let's be honest, I suppose I'm grateful for people's obsession with crime because it's kept me in my job for so long. The book is, I hate to think of it as a memoir because although it looks back over 35 years of crime reporting, I'm not on the verge of retiring. I'm looking forward to the next 30 years, unless other people at Sky News have got different ideas. The stories really don't change, but they do keep coming. And I certainly don't look back with rose-tinted spectacles at a different time, because times have always been very violent. I mean, you could argue that there was more violence around hundreds of years ago when, tens of thousands of people used to queue up and make their way to go and watch public executions. Violence in a greater sense was all around people. The worst story I've ever covered, the darkest crime I've ever covered, was in 1994, the Cromwell Street murders by Fred and Rose West. It was the most troubling story of these two seemingly happy-go-lucky married couple with a loving family who were torturing, butchering, raping and killing and burying in their house more than a dozen young women. Nothing has ever come close to the horror of that story for me. How do you
react to a story like that? And do you get an inkling that something, because I was going to talk about the Wests, because that is now a story that had such a profound effect, like the Bulger murder, on society in general, that the whole nation sort of stops and goes, what on earth? Or words to that effect. And it is worse than any sort of Hollywood scriptwriter could even come up with.
Yeah, sorry. What the question was? How do
you deal with that in a report? Does the reporting mode just kick in? But B, do you have an inkling that this is going to be the sort of story that stops the nation?
Oh, I think. How do I deal with it? Firstly, I am very good at compartmentalizing stuff. I don't take it home with me. That doesn't mean I'm not unfeeling or it doesn't affect me. But I've never had to ask for any counselling. I mean, my colleagues are offered it, and I know some of them do accept it. I'm very focused when I'm doing covering a case because it's my job, and I get paid very well to do the best job I can, and I can only do that if I don't get deflected by the horror or other considerations. Certainly, the story of the Cromwell Street murders, it soon became clear that this was a story that was going to grip the nation in many ways. It was really the body count. First one body, then two. Then we heard that the daughter of Fred and Rose was one of their victims who was buried under the patio. And so it went on. And I think what also struck me about it was that their victims were young, vulnerable women. Some of them went back many years to a time in the 60s and 70s when young women were traveling on their own around the country, hitchhiking, accepting lifts from strangers. And that was the norm. And for a dozen or so of the very unluckiest, they accepted lifts from Fred and Rose West because the car stopped. They felt they were in no danger, particularly from this cheery-looking couple, the roly-poly wife, the gap-tooth, curly-haired driver who smiled all the time, who looked nothing as much as the couple from Darling Buds of May, the Larkins. That's the kind of image that the West had. So you could understand why young women in those days would be enticed into their car, particularly women who were looking for a lift. And I also remember, it struck me when I was doing the story, that my own sister, who's a bit older than me, used to hitchhike from our home in Ely in Cambridgeshire to Hull, to university. Used to hitchhike up the A1 and accept lifts from lorry drivers and all sorts of people. And I and our parents didn't bat an eyelid.
Yeah, it was a different time, wasn't it? And then, of course, you have cases like you had cases like in the 70s, like Peter Sutcliffe, for example, and that put the fear into women sort of travel, even going out at night. But that idea of happily hitchhiking with your thumb out the side of the road really it belongs to a different time indeed. Do you? It's a tricky one though, because we're saying about young, women. They read crime fiction, and they, but they're also the victims of crime. And you mentioned, the two drug dealers who came down and committed murder in your sleepy patch. Do you think perhaps the Hollywood movies, TV dramas, because we are besieged on TV with cold cases and detectives and CSI and all etc. Is there a certain point where that perhaps the interest in crime comes because it's being a little bit glamorized by certain aspects of the media?
And one of the things that I have to be very careful about is not glamorizing criminals and their crimes. It does get very difficult in certain circumstances. A few years ago, I interviewed a Playboy gangster. He was that kind of figure by anybody's measure, Valerio Vice, and he pulled off the Knightsbridge safe deposit heist opposite Harrods. He was a very glamorous, very handsome, very articulate Italian. And I went to interview him in Italy. He'd got jailed at the Old Bailey for 22 years. After 4 years, he managed to persuade the authorities to send him back to Italy to serve his sentence there. Within a couple of years, he was out on weekend leave. So you could understand why he wanted to go back to Italy. Very different penal system. But I sat on the beach in Pescara and chatted to him, and he absolutely cut this very glamorous figure. And however hard I tried to be in questioning him and his morals, I don't think I got the better of him. But even the judge in his case described him as a man of charm and then banged him up for 22 years, so rather spoiled it. But the copper who nailed Vice was out with me in Italy on that same trip, eating and drinking with him. So I think we all kind of got caught up in his web and glamorized him more than we should have done. And, a very similar crime, you talk about how crimes get repeated. The Hatton Garden heist, so many years later, 6-7 years ago, and the old Diamond Weezers who were the gang that pulled that off. I mean, everybody got caught up in that. And it was, again, very difficult not to glamorize or treat with a bit of fun this old gang of villains who had broken into this vault and then completely mucked it up afterwards by making some very silly mistakes.
As a broadcaster who's sitting not too far from a beach near Marbella, I am somewhat familiar with the concept of diamond geezers sitting on a beach and drinking sangria and toasting their past successes. Do you think that perhaps we have as you said before, there's something also, I'm not talking about violent crime, but something like a bank heist, a diamond job, East End geezers. It may be a bit sort of myth making, but there is perhaps perhaps people take comfort in, or not comfort, but they think they've got a better understanding, or even it's a sneaking admiration for those who get away with quote unquote old fashioned crime.
They do. Of course, there's nothing like, there isn't any victimless crime. Even the Hatton Garden heist, when the immediate thought was, well, the only people who've lost are diamond dealers and they can afford to lose a few gems. The reality was that most of the people who lost their stuff in that heist had stored it in that vault because they couldn't afford the insurance premiums of keeping jewels in their little premises. And they weren't great big diamond dealers. They were little craftsmen working in the tiny workshops in the jewellery quarter of Hatton Garden. Some of them went bust. So I'm very keen never to lose the sense that there are always victims in crime. But I think to a lot of people, they thought it was a victimless crime, and they thought that the victims were people who could afford to lose a lot of those valuables.
What's the relationship like between a crime reporter and court staff, and also obviously the police forces? Do they regard you as a help, as a hindrance of trying to get the message out there, or are you just regarded as something on the periphery?
We do have trouble with court officials sometimes, who sort of treat us as the lowest of the low. It's a bit of an issue in court, because I say in the book about how there's a diagram outside a lot of courtrooms that shows you, visitors, exactly who's who in the courtroom, and it covers everybody, but there's no reference to the court reporter. And of course, we do play a very valuable role. I mean, I would say that anyway, wouldn't I? But we are the public's representative. There are only maybe a dozen seats for the public in any court. So we're there to tell the public what's being done. Justice is being meted out in their name. Talk about the police. I mean, we could talk for hours about the relationship between crime reporters and the cops. It used to be great. Now it's not very good at all. The Leveson report, the Filkin report, a dozen years ago, these were two reports that followed the phone hacking scandal, that looked at the ethics and the relationship between police and the media, and decided between them that we should stop going out and having meals and drinks with our police sources. And every time a police officer had any contact with a journalist, it had to be recorded. So the whole notion of a crime reporter having, confidential sources went out of the window, because cops caught talking to me and briefing me about something that wasn't within their immediate remit, were threatened with disciplinary action or worse. And some cops, because of their relationship with crime reporters, did lose their jobs. And it's going to be very difficult to claw that back, I think, that relationship.
And in a world where everybody with a phone or a vlog or a blog or an Instagram account or a TikTok account suddenly thinks they're a journalist or they're a news source, how difficult is it for you to do your job and to get your voice across from the interference and the fuzz that is which basically seems to be the media at the moment?
Well, those armchair sleuths who left their armchairs and go to the scene of the crime, like they did with the disappearance of the dog walker Nicola Bulley in Lancashire in January, they do get in our way to a degree, and they certainly wind up the police. And I think we all suffer because they become described as citizen journalists, and I think for the police, we all get lumped together and are sometimes seen as a nuisance. Don't forget, though, the police can't do without us. They need us to cover appeals for information. If they held a press conference and we didn't turn up, they'd look rather stupid. They need us to publicise warnings about terror threats and so forth. And they also need us to sing their praises. If we can persuade them to tell us their successes, we will cover them. I mean, as a crime reporter, I always tell the police, we want nothing better than a good detective story. They're not very good at telling us how well they're doing. They just, they think we're obsessed with their errors and their mistakes. And when bad things happen, they tend to, these days, pull up the drawbridge, pull down the shutters, and don't really want to talk to us. On the other hand, talking about social media, people filming stuff on their cameras, it helps us. We use it. People offer it to us, or we see it on social media, on Facebook or TikTok or Twitter. And 9 times out of 10, it's stuff that we can use. So they are a benefit to us as well.
Many people know you from standing outside the Old Bailey, giving a report, or any other court, or many other courts of justice through the UK. What's been the most memorable, that sort of moment before the judge passes sentence or the jury comes back in? Which sticks in your mind, would you say, thus far in your career?
There are so many moments of courtroom drama. I still think that the trial of Rose West was the most dramatic. It was breathtaking stuff. One thing in particular was the evidence of Anna Marie, who was Fred's daughter and Rose West's stepdaughter. She gave evidence against her stepmother, Rose West, and she told in excruciating detail and in a very dull, monotonous voice her experience of being taken down into the cellar of 25 Cromwell Street and being tied to some awful contraption that her father had built and being tied up and raped in turn by her father and her mother, and being told while they were doing that this was a parent's way of showing their children how much they loved them. Now, if that wasn't enough and horrific enough, it was the next thing that Anna Marie said. She said that the next morning after these ordeals, she would walk to school with her friends thinking that she wasn't alone, that all her school friends were being put through the same ordeal every night by their parents, because that was the way they showed them how much they loved them. And you can imagine the chill, the silence in the courtroom when Anna Marie, poor Anna Marie, was reliving this ordeal that she was suffering since the age of 8 years old. Nothing has ever come close to that, Giles.
What do you hope that people will take from your book?
I hope more than anything they'll get a sense of what it's like to be a crime reporter. There are great stories. I mean, there are heroes and villains, cops and robbers, gangsters, diamond thieves, killers. I hope they'll get an understanding of why it's important to report these stories. But, I also want people to be entertained. That might sound a bit odd. There is humour in the book. There are some, interesting, amusing anecdotes, quite a few, I think. But most important, all of that has to be set against the backdrop that there are, in every crime I cover, there are victims. And, in portraying some of the humour of the job, I hope, I'm pretty sure I'm not being disrespectful to any of those victims, but I hope people will find it readable, insightful. It's part of, I hope, the fascination with true crime. It won't be for everybody. It is a bit grim in places, but I hope they'll find ultimately that it's uplifting. And I do talk to a lot of villains, but I do talk to some victims as well, and perhaps they'll get an understanding of, from all of the people I interview, how they go about their jobs, cops, villains, how the victims have coped with their ordeals.
And finally, the title. I mean, apart from the double negative, no one got cracked over the head for no reason. Please explain.
You spotted that double negative.
Oh, absolutely.
Do you know, I've always thought when I write a book, that's going to be the title. And I'll tell you where it comes from. A few years ago, there was a demonstration outside the House of Commons, and it wasn't your normal demonstration. It was, the protesters were country folk, rather well-heeled, farmers, landowners, and they were dressed in barber coats and posh wellies and smart brogues. They were protesting against the Labour government's plans to bring in a ban on fox hunting. So you can understand the dynamics. And these were all people, conservative with a small c, mostly, who you would think were core supporters of the police, of law and order. Anyway, it turned into a punch-up, got very rowdy. Blows were thrown. The police pulled out their batons and hit people a few times. And the next morning, we had our regular briefing with the Commissioner of Scotland Yard, Sir John Stevens. And one of our mob asked him, why did your officers lash out like that against your core supporters? And Sir John Stevens paused and then said, no one got cracked over the head for no reason. It was a bit garbled, but we did know what he meant. And I mean, John is normally a very, very articulate chap, but for some reason he got slightly thrown. And I thought that title will either intrigue people or it will confuse them. And I'm not sure which way it's going at the moment, Giles.
Well, the thing is, I assume that was from some East End lag saying, yeah, well, we did the job, but no one ever get cracked over for no reason. But now you say it's the Met Police Commissioner. It makes it even more brilliant.
Yeah, it's Britain's top cop, as he was then. And I tell you what, something else, I don't put this in the book, but it's an illustration of the relationship between cops and police, cops and hacks as it then existed. After the briefing, we used to gather around the tea trolley and have a natter with Sir John and so forth. And I remember him, the reporter who'd asked him the question was Ben Taylor from the Daily Mail, a young reporter then. And I remember distinctly John Stevens had him in a headlock by the tea trolley because he was a bit miffed. He'd been drawn into this rather garbled response. Now, John Stevens went on to be a peer of the realm. And Ben Taylor has just been appointed the esteemed editor of the Sunday Times. But, I guess both of them are glad that there's no photograph of that headlock in the press room at Scotland Yard.
What happens by the press room tea trolley stays by the press room tea trolley. I think we'll agree. The book is called No One Got Cracked Over the Head for No Reason, Dispatches from a Crime Reporter. It's by Martin Brunt. Martin, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. I hope the sun's still shining.
The sun is still shining, Martin. All is well in the world. Martin Brunt, thanks for your time today.